try and talk as little as possible as part of this initial introduction, because we had just a fantastic discussion in our group. We had a bunch of all-stars in there to talk about the subjects of precision medicine and clinical trials and the problems that those two areas are facing. And had a lot of great ideas about problems that we ended up distilling to two main areas that we focused the rest of our discussions on. And we summarized those two problem areas, and this addresses both precision medicine and clinical trials simultaneously, as a signal to noise problem and a data from subject to data set problem. And what we meant by signal to noise was that I think we've all appreciated that our patients offer certain characteristics that are clearly evident at the bedside at an individual level that are frequently lost in clinical trials when we study things at the population level. And so we need better methods and approaches to characterizing those phenotypes, was a word that we use frequently, and distilling them from the noise of the population that will allow us actually, though, to still study those patients on scale so we can develop new approaches to diagnosing and treating them. And so ways to learn from the noise was a common theme, how to measure that noise, predicting and prognosticating based on patient characteristics, and figuring out ways that we can enrich our studies so that we're focusing in on individual needs at the scale that's necessary for a study. And then data from subject to data set maybe speaks for itself a little bit, but this really has to do with the challenges related to the efficiency of data collection. And we heard some of that already this morning by very experienced trialists who spoke on the subject. But that would almost seems like actually a decrease in efficiency, as one person in our group put it, in that it used to be that there was just one transcription step, and then the study data would move over to the study database. So the research coordinator would collect things onto a case report form, and that case report form would then be part of the eventual analyses. Now the teams, they record data in the EHR. The EHR is then sometimes transcribed to paper, and then that paper is then transcribed into a database. And it's at best no more efficient. At worst, it's less efficient than it historically was. And then there's also a lot of noise in the data that we deal with, and I had some sense that this may have even been made worse by the electronic record. But there's a lot of things, a lot of patterns that we recognize as people that aren't necessarily able to be automated in a very easy way. And one of the examples that was provided was the idea that detecting noise in a pulse oximetry signal versus a true deterioration event. Well, we have ways of doing that as a human when we look at the waveforms, but automating that so that we filter out the noise for a study while still collecting the meaningful data is more challenging. And there is, I think, a widely appreciated need in our group for much more sophisticated approaches to filter the noise that's intrinsic to electronic data. And then underlying all of those, and I think maybe even wrapping around those two big problems, was just the expensive nature and the resource intensity that goes into both precision medicine studies as well as clinical trials that are, especially those that are seeking to leverage precision medicine. And so in crafting and thinking about what the technological solutions would be for these two areas, we focused a lot on automated EHR data extraction. And there was a desire to get all data. So not just limiting ourselves to the flow sheets or to the diagnostic codes, but thinking more broadly about ventilators and the waveforms, the bedside monitor, the longitudinal data, patient-reported outcomes, things that happen after a patient leaves the hospital. How do we capture that in an efficient way across the continuum of care? And then using sophisticated techniques like algorithms and AI-based approaches to filter those data, perform validity checks, and distinguish between what is noise versus what is real, which we sometimes take for granted as human beings being able to do very easily when we look at a flow sheet. and part of what relates to the challenges with automating EHR data extraction wasn't so much that some of these tools don't exist, it's just that the bandwidth isn't really there from the people who have access to those tools to actually help us implement our trials. So at the local level, it was mentioned in our group that the teams that could turn on the research modules, for example, in Cerner or Epic, tend to have other priorities. And there's a lack of standardized ETL tools, a lack of mapping and harmonization that's been done across the different electronic record data sources. And then, of course, there's the need to define computational phenotypes. And so that is, how do we look across all of these data once we've actually assembled them and identify those relevant subtypes of patients that we should focus our studies more closely on. So the ultimate prototype, or the concept, I should say, that we developed as a group really focused on some key characteristics of a tool. And there was a variety of ways that it was proposed that this tool could be deployed. And we decided not to get stuck too much in the the technical weeds, so to speak, about how this would look in reality. But in general, there was a desire to have an easy-to-use user interface to look at data that would be encountered during the course of a trial, and to use that user interface to run simulations about the conduct of a trial so that we could understand what might work and what might not work based on real-world data. And then to take that insight and then use those insights to generate tools that could be deployed to local study sites. So using those simulations, using our understanding of the breadth of data that would be available from a representative sample, construct tools that can then be taken to the individual study sites, perhaps have an easier time getting over some of the governance hurdles that I think many people are familiar with when we talk about extracting electronic record from the data, and using those tools to characterize phenotypes, to facilitate things like screening and enrollment, to capture the data that are relevant for the study while using sophisticated approaches to filter the noise out of those data, and then capturing those data really importantly in a longitudinal fashion so we start to understand the long-term trajectories of our patients. And then also coupling those data with biobanks and repositories that are also essential for defining the precision phenotypes. And so that's what we landed on, sort of a broad concept. We had some discussions about how that might work technically, but I'll spare the larger group of those for the moment here. And I think with that, I'm happy to turn it over and invite sort of thoughts, comments, maybe from my group to start with, anything that I left out that would be worth mentioning at this point. But it was really a fantastic discussion. We did, I should offer, we did level set too in terms of what the PDC is doing these days and how the PDC specifically might be leveraged for some of these efforts. And so there are PDC members as well who might be thinking of ideas already as I'm speaking about how the PDC might help fulfill this. I think now's a great time to have a discussion about those also.
It could be a long, complex discussion.
Yeah, it could be.
But the long-range vision is simply that, to be able to provide a large data source of high-quality data that people can use. That's exactly the ultimate goal of the PDC, to have a large collection of granular data, not just EHR data, but we've discussed ways of waveform data and radiology stuff and et cetera, plus be able to support compute power for people to use and provide some tools and to have access. But we're very much in the early stages at the moment, harmonizing the EHR data we have. And you'll get to hear all about that, but that'll be good because we'd love your input in what to build on it. But the goal is no, I won't go any further.
Wow, that was a really short comment from West. Take that. Jen and then Robbie and then
I think I'm sort of paraphrasing Scott's comment anyway, but I think the interface that is able to be used by individuals who don't have a PhD in data science, and how do you make the data queryable, and the computer human interface for the researchers and for the QI folks and those who are using the data, I think was sort of fleshed out as well, and something right for PDC, I think.
Okay.
I think one of the things our group was operating on a little bit with the PDC was that we wouldn't really be able to get access to this data in real time. And a lot of times what is really relevant for clinical trials is being able to have that data in real time, not only to screen and identify patients, but then also to pull the data that you're going to use, especially if you're doing, analyses, et cetera, on them. So I would put that back to this group is there a way that we could leverage, any of the work that's being done either by the PDC to translate back to the local site to be able to help get that data in real time to support clinical trials? Or can, the speed at which the data is gathered basically within the PDC support that? Because I think to do what we would really have loved to do within clinical trials would be to get all that data, harmonized to be able to use for the trial itself immediately.
The ultimate goal is to make it near real time. The goal is to make it near real time. Very close, because I see it serving CDS purposes. So, you don't want to wait until the patient's discharged to find out what you want to know. Although you can do that for research. But yes, the technology exists to get there. We're in the build the pipes phase, but there's no reason. And then have the data products available in as fast as the electrons can move for the members of the PDC to access.
I'm sort of doing something illegal, making a comment before other people that are before me. But I would say, the whole thing about data, people joke that data science is 80% data processing and 20% complaining about data processing. It's actually true here in the sense that the work that we're putting into harmonizing the data at the centralized level in PDC will allow you then to, once that a single site is harmonized and we know what quality measures potentially through AI filtering of validity checks specific for that site, we know what we're expecting. We can harmonize that data directly because we already have those pipelines built, and we can check whether that data is correct or not. And we can do that on a nightly download of data. We can do it on an hourly download of data, whatever the lawyers will let us do.
The problem will not be us managing the data, it will be getting it out of your hospital. Yeah.
I don't know if he intentionally set that up or not, but you brought up a concept that I think is really important, and I think that we as a group need to kind of figure out how to deal with it. And maybe I'm just ignorant and it's already been dealt with and y'all actually know the technique. But the concept is, you mentioned signal to noise ratio and how patients are different, right? Some kids are one way, other kids have the same variables being recorded, but they're completely different kids. And in data, they look identical. At the bedside, they don't. And, you wanted to know, how do we encode that, or how do we leverage information out of that? And I'm going to turn around and say harmonization is what we're using as a tool to suppress that kind of knowledge, right? So is there a strategy? Do you have, or does anybody in the room have a strategy for extracting that nuance of the individual patient out of a population of data that we're hoping is homogeneous enough to actually detect population signal to noise rather than individual signal to noise?
It's called ChatGPT. I think Tim was going to, and then Barry, and then...
Yeah, this is just more of a question of someone who sometimes struggles turning his computer on. What activation energy do we have to do do we have to overcome to get this done? This to me seems like almost a no-brainer. It's like you're taking data from one spot and dumping it into forms. But obviously, and again, I don't understand why this hasn't been done years ago. And, it seems like pharma or someone else would have solved this problem. So for those in the room or in the group, why haven't we solved this problem?
I think there's clear barriers at the level of the vendors to begin with. It's not in their interest to make data too accessible so that third parties can start to enter into the marketplace. There's just real world challenges in terms of how these systems are set up, in terms of how heterogeneous they are. No instance of Epic is alike, no instance of Cerner is alike. And then there's the increasing recognition, just like everyone in this group, I think, recognizes that data are incredibly powerful and highly valuable. If you think about the training that goes into simply collecting them with the personnel that we have at the bedside, let alone all of the unrecognized insights that can be generated from it, it's almost priceless how much those data hold on to. And the companies know this, which is why you see Oracle wanting, I think, to create a large national data set, or Epic moving everything into Caboodle for its insights, or increasingly possessive for those reasons. That's why I think it was Nelson, you mentioned this morning about federal legislation in this space to actually push people to be interoperable with their data. And that's what's become necessary in this country. We're not Scandinavia. We don't have one electronic record across the entire nation. And so I think it's become necessary for the federal government to become involved on some level to push. But collaboratives like the PDC are leading the way, because the government mandates are far behind what's already been accomplished by people in this room.
Okay, thanks.
If we were in the UK, could we do this tomorrow?
No. You mentioned there the bandwidth too, right? Like this is hard work. People assume that the EHR is like easy. The EHR is the easy part, and it's not. It's really hard, right? And it's a bandwidth issue, so it's a prioritization issue, I think, at this point. The PDC is doing something because we're crowdsourcing it as a group, and we're doing it not as individuals trying to move the needle forward, but as a group saying, okay, we're all going to harmonize the data in this way. We're going to, so distribute a little bit the efforts, right?
So a quick comment about that, and then another question. Haven't the adults figured this out? Isn't that how they were able to do 20 clinical trials on COVID in a year across the country? I mean, these are large pragmatic trials. Maybe we're being too precise. Having said that, I thought this topic, and forgive me if you mentioned it, precision medicine, I thought this was more like along the paradigm, meaning you study the patient's physiology or their genetics or their immunology to enroll them in the trial, so that we get much more homogeneous, and or Hector Wong's data or whatever.
So that was definitely a large theme that came out of the discussion in the group, and then I think some of the discussion there came to, okay, what could we do as next steps? What could we do leveraging PDC or other similarly curated data sets? And so the idea was, could you identify some of those phenotypes with patient-generated data, so linking the biomarker data with the patient-generated data to then perhaps move away from the need for the point-of-care biomarker assessments. Maybe the data are already there, we just don't know how to find it, or maybe there are other phenotypes that we don't know about that we don't currently measure that you could find in the data. And so that was very much built in with the recognition that you need the data first to drive that.
Yeah, sort of related to that, one of the other things we talked about in terms of using a really granular data set like PDC is to be hypothesis generating and to understand what subphenotypes exist within some of the common conditions that we treat. So one child with bronchiolitis responds differently to one therapy or asthma or so have you. So could we use PDC to be hypothesis generating, understand what the different subphenotypes are for these conditions, and then design trials that specifically target in on one piece of a very heterogeneous population?
Hypothesis generating was used to call the fishing expedition, and it was a bad word. And now that's the terminology that NIH asks us to use so that we can actually do it.
We're reclaiming it. I just wanted to follow up on something that Randall alluded to, I thought, and I'm curious if this fits into this vision, but are we talking with both clinical decision support and identifying patients for trials actually being able to re-identify patients or not de-identifying patients as part of this infrastructure? Because I think that's a key kind of conceptual branch point.
Each institution has its own key, but the data we currently have is all de-identified. And we go to great extent to make sure what we have now is actually anonymized all the way on multiple checks. But that's obviously, if you're going to do real-time decision support, you don't want to lose your patient. And when you're doing a research study, you're going to want cohort determination and go back and find those patients. So yes, there'll have to be a way to identify individual patients. And both those are different problems, but I am willing to bet that all of the sessions today will have data aggregation and access as part of their problem.
So much as I love the vision of real-time streaming of data to the PDC cloud, I don't know that we could ever achieve that, for example, at our institution. But I do think that the PDC has short-term potential for a version of this model. If it is a locally maintained schema that is already well curated, and Reed, I might pick on you to explain what you're already doing in Seattle, that is well curated, that could provide high quality data at whatever frequency is necessary to the study team, importantly for consented patients. And if the patients have already said, yep, you can have all my data, you can send it to Chicago, you can send it to Pittsburgh, you can send it to wherever, then the governance issues are much, much easier. So I think there's a potential for a short-term win.
Another model. So another model to consider for clinical trials is the federated model, right? So you have everybody has their data in the same schema, and you send everybody's running the same trial, and you send queries to each site, and what you get is aggregated data for the performance of the trial in that site. So you don't get individual patient level data; you only get the aggregated outcomes for that, and you have there's ways to weigh the effects per site into a centralized outcome of all the individual site performances, and then you can you can change randomization based on that and whatnot. So there's a way to keep the data at the sites if we want it. I would say keeping the I think we talked about the noise and the quality checks. I think that's the thing that scares me the most about the distributed approaches, is that you don't know what's happening at its individual sites, right? You know what's happening in your site, and you have sort of that ability to be really strict about the quality of the data and how you're doing those validity checks. But if you can't assure that at every single site, is the data that you're getting back real? Is it a ChatGPT situation where it looks good, but is it actually good? Are they actually following the procedures? Are we matching all the right variables? And so I think that's a next person to talk, maybe the director of a data coordinator center, but that's a scary piece, right? Like how do you actually ensure that, right?
So the NCI tried to do the federated approach with CA Big, and it blew up because it's such a large ask, and then they threw $360 million at it, and all of the records of CA Big have been expunged from the internet. You can't even find it anywhere. So there. One of the problems that we've encountered, because we have a project that we've had for about 6 years of delivering monthly report cards on ED physicians' handling of events in their EDs, and we collect the entire ED record on a monthly basis. One of the problems is that Cerner and Epic and all of these vendors, they make sure that the clinicians see a consistent interface on the screen, so that if they look for a birth date, the birth date is next to the word birth date. But they can move stuff in the back. And our extractions are not through a simple SQL query. Our extractions are bulk extractions from the back end of the database. And one thing to keep in mind about real time, we have to check every extraction we get to make sure that the data didn't move. And Epic and Cerner, they will move it without even notifying their hospital necessarily for database efficiency purposes. And so one of the things that's important is what's the purpose of the electronic record? And is it really to help the hospital bill? Is it theoretically to help clinical care? And Bob Tamburo had a comment that I think he ought to restate that has to do with the dichotomy or apparent dichotomy between research and clinical care, which is that, you want to restate it? Which is, these should be one. And so, and you know, Jerry Zimmerman wrote a paper about every patient in the PICU ought to be on a research protocol. And every patient that, if you were thinking about equity, every patient is entitled to have access to a research protocol. So that maybe reframing the question so that doing research and doing clinical care are not thought of as separate things could help us reformulate the IT staff thing. The earlier question about what impedes IT from doing this, at our institution, Tim, we have about 600 IT personnel that are devoted to Epic and the EDW, and they don't have time to turn on the FHIR interface between REDCap and Epic. So that's some of why this doesn't happen. It's just pure bandwidth of IT staff.
I think, Rishi, we're next. You still.
So I think one of the issues that we have to be cognizant of are some prior work in this space, like Mimic, which is mentioned earlier. So that if we take Mimic as a case study, it shows you that you could have a single harmonized perfect data set, and everyone could build all sorts of models on it, but none of those models will actually translate to real generalizable real world practice or use, because they've just been over curated and are perfect in all their sense. Missingness has been imputed and all, you do so much pre-processing, it just no longer reflects the real world data, which is messy, which is, you have 3 different variables for bilirubin, you have like 3 different age ranges, you have weight in ounces and in kilos, and you have just a mess of a system. So I wonder, that's a call for keeping data as close to the source as possible, so that when it comes time to translating it, even though we do, and this is kind of a terrible thing to say, but we do admit that there is going to be algorithmic heterogeneity. Some algorithms will seem to perform better in one site for the other, but without prospective validation and real world observations, I think all of these are just conjecture.
One comment about that we sort of thought about early in the PDC, how when we were defining this, instead of going directly to a common data model like OMAP and say everybody needs to do an OMAP mapping of their data and then send it to PDC, we decided to keep the schema as close to the original, sort of the data elements. We collect all the data source names so that we can then map back, our concept of blood pressure that may be mapped to 4 different concepts in Seattle. We know what those concepts are, and we expect those concepts. We can count the expected number of times that each one is going to come or where they're going to be coming. So that if we build a tool, we want to translate it back to Seattle, we know what Seattle calls blood pressure and where we would expect that to be at. So that's an important piece, that you can't keep going through these pipelines of quality checks and curation and getting farther without keeping ties to what the raw source data looks like. And even for the source values of those data, if you're doing quality checks, still keep the original values, because you may be able to learn from that noise alone. So
that came up in our group as well. With respect to regulatory considerations for trial conduct and the importance of being able to track from the CRF back to the source of truth. And the more steps you take, it's the more opportunity for error. And the more points you have to prove under an audit or certainly under something that's overseen by the FDA, it becomes quite challenging.
Last comment for this group. Keeping us on track here.
A lot of pressure. All right, I'll be quick. Just to follow up on the comment about re-identifying to use the PDC-like data set for clinical trials, I don't necessarily know if you would need to re-identify or if there were a way to simply identify which patients were in a particular cohort for a particular trial in the PDC, then you would have those groupings in a data set such as the PDC. You don't actually need to go back to the individual institutions to re-identify those patients. You would just end up with a cluster of patients from all of the institutions, and you'd have whether they were on or off or what particular tag they were in that trial. So it's another way to do that type of work, which I think was what Chris and this group were proposing without the re-identification element.
I think that was excellent discussion. It sounds like it was a lot of fun group